Some forests don't feel empty, they feel watchful. Stepping inside can feel like crossing into a place that doesn't want you there. Join me, I'm gonna count down 15 of the creepiest forests in the world. Number 15. The Bialowieza Forest, Poland and Belarus. Bialowieza does not feel frightening because of any legend. It feels frightening because it shows what much of Europe looked like before roads, drainage systems, and timber extraction changed everything. UNESCO describes it as an immense transboundary area of primary forest that covers about 180,000 acres on the border of Poland and Belarus. Large parts of it have remained undisturbed for centuries. In many modern forests, people are never far away, even when they think they are. In this forest, the scale of the old growth and the lack of any obvious human ordering can make the place feel older than anything else around it. And what makes it really unsettling is the amount of dead wood in there. UNESCO highlights the richness of standing and falling dead wood as one of the reasons the forest is so important ecologically. And that means you're not walking through a neatly managed woodland where every fallen trunk has been cleared away. You're moving through a place where the natural world is allowed to continue, where collapse, decay, fungi, insects, and regrowth are all visible all at once. The forest also does support a complete food web, including large mammals and large carnivores like wolves and lynx, along with the largest free-roaming population of European bison. Even without seeing those animals, knowing they're part of the living system here changes the atmosphere immediately. There is also something psychologically heavy about a forest that has survived so long in such a natural state. It's not dramatic in the same way as a mangrove full of tigers or a rainforest full of crocodiles. This fear is slower, comes from silence, depth, and the sense that the forest is operating by its own rules rather than yours. The old trees, the saturated ground, the wet meadows, the river corridors, they all remind you that this is not a landscaped nature. It's one of the last great lowland forests of its kind in Europe. That's exactly why it's so valuable, and exactly why so many people find it unnerving. Number 14. Aokigahara Forest in Japan. On the northwestern side of Mount Fuji sits Aokigahara. It's often called the Sea of Trees. What makes it immediately different from other forests is that it grew on hardened lava from Fuji's major eruption in 864. Official Japanese tourism sources describe it as a dense forest covering about 30 square kilometers with a floor made of volcanic rock. The ground is uneven, the roots twist across stone instead of sinking deep into normal soil, and the whole forest feels as if it formed over a wound in the earth rather than over ordinary land. Aokigahara's fear is mostly sensory. The Japan National Tourism Organization notes that the porous lava bedrock absorbs sound, which adds to the sense of isolation in there. Many forests are noisy even when they look dark. The wind moves through the leaves, the branches scrape, the birds call, and water carries sound. Aokigahara can feel unusually muted. The quiet is real, and it comes from geology. Yamanashi's official guide also notes that the designated paths connect major lava caves in the area, including Narasawa Ice Cave, Fugaku Wind Cave, and the West Lake Bat Cave. So, the forest is not just dense woods, it's a volcanic landscape full of voids, tubes, and cold cavities beneath the surface. Aokigahara is famous enough that people sometimes repeat the claims that compasses stop working there, but Yamanashi's tourism guide explicitly says that that's a misconception, and that compasses behave normally when held at a normal height. The real danger here is simpler. The forest is dense, the terrain is rough, the ground is irregular, and visitors are advised not to stray from official paths. In other words, Aokigahara is not scary because it breaks the laws of nature, but because it follows them so completely. It is a forest built on lava, packed with caves wrapped in quiet, and it is easy to underestimate. Number 13. The Red Forest of Ukraine. The Red Forest near Chernobyl is frightening because almost everything that makes it dangerous is invisible. After the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, the areas closest to the source of the radioactive release in the 30-kilometer exclusion zone were the most affected, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Red Forest near the industrial site became one of the most contaminated places in that zone. Unlike a storm-damaged forest or a burned forest, this destruction here came from radiation. You couldn't see the force that caused it, and that still gives the place its power. Now, the name comes from what happened to the pine trees after the incident. They died and turned a reddish-brown color, creating one of the most recognizable images from the disaster zone. The Atomic Energy Agency later noted that a new forest matured near the closed plant where the so-called Red Forest stood in 1986, and that human exposure levels in contaminated areas had dropped substantially. But that does not make the place ordinary again. The same agency material also notes long-term ecosystem effects in the exclusion zone and references contamination in the Red Forest area near the Chernobyl industrial site. This is a landscape where nature returned, but it returned on contaminated ground. This is what makes the Red Forest so unnerving. A normal forest will give you visible clues about risk. You can spot a cliff, maybe deep water, fire scars, or animal tracks. The Red Forest does not always offer that. Trees grow, animals move, seasons change, and yet the history of contamination is part of the environment. The broader exclusion zone, though, is still essentially uninhabited. According to the IAEA, which tells you everything about how the place is understood even decades later, it is one of the few forests on Earth where regrowth itself is eerie, and because the new life does not erase the disaster underneath it. Number 12. The Daintree rainforest in Australia. All right, we're going down under for this one. The Daintree, it's frightening in a very direct way. It's not fear built on folklore or mystery. It's fear about the terrain, the weather, and wildlife that deserve your respect. Queensland's Park Service describes Daintree National Park as the traditional country of the eastern Kulu-Yalanji people, and note that the park includes Mossman Gorge and Cape Tribulation. In the Cape Tribulation section, steep mountain ranges rise from the coast and are cut by numerous creeks and rivers. In the Mossman Gorge section, rugged slopes trap the ocean moisture and create frequent rainfall. It's that combination that produces a place that is lush, beautiful, and easy to misread as harmless. Official park warnings state plainly that crocodiles are potentially dangerous and that people should never take unnecessary risks in crocodile habitats. Another park page warns that crocodiles may be present in any body of water near Noah Creek and tells visitors to stay away from the water's edge. The safety guidance for Mossman Gorge is equally as blunt. Water conditions can change rapidly, currents are strong, and entering the river will be dangerous. This is one of those places where the rainforest does not separate neatly from the river, the mangroves, or even the coast. The danger moves with the landscape. Then there's the wildlife that gives the forest its almost prehistoric feeling. Of course, it's Australia, so Queensland's Park Service describes the southern cassowary as a large flightless bird that can reach 2 meters in height and says it's vital to seed dispersal in the rainforest. Visitors are repeatedly told to be cassowary, which sounds playful, until you realize the warning appears alongside crocodile alerts. Now, boardwalks in the park pass through lowland rainforests and creek systems, and some areas are closed during the wet season or after cyclones and heavy rain. So the Daintree earns its place here because it doesn't need a story added to it. It is already a dense, wet, living system full of real hazards. Number 11. The Sundarbans, Bangladesh and India. If there's a forest on this list that really truly feels designed to keep people off balance, it is the Sundarbans. UNESCO describes it as one of the largest mangrove forests in the world, lying on the delta of the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna rivers on the Bay of Bengal. It's cut through by tidal waterways, mudflats, and small islands of salt-tolerant mangrove forest. It's been described as a region as a network of estuaries, tidal rivers, and creeks enclosing the flat, marshy, densely forested lands. So before you even think about the wildlife, the geography is already difficult. This is a forest where the land is fragmented, the channels are shifting the logic of your movement, and the water is never just a background. What makes the Sundarbans especially intimidating, though, is that it's the only place in the world where tigers live among the coastal mangrove forests. The World Wildlife Foundation notes that this landscape has one of the highest human-tiger conflict rates in the world. Now, that single fact changes how you imagine the place. In many tiger habitats, the threat comes from dense jungle or grassland. In the Sundarbans, the predator belongs to a landscape of tides, roots, muds, and islands, and those tigers can swim between the mangrove channels. People entering the forest for work or transport are moving through territory where the boundary between land and water is already unstable. The forest here is also frightening because it really never lets you settle into one of its rules. A boat may be safer than walking in one moment and more exposed in the next. A patch of ground may look firm until the tide changes or the mud gives way, and a maze of creeks and estuaries means navigation is part of the danger, not just the backdrop. And because it spans a low-lying delta, it is a place where ecology and human vulnerability are tied together. The result is a forest that feels alive in a way most do not. It is not still, and it is not stable. It shifts, it floods, and it contains one of the world's most formidable predators. Number 10. The Darien Gap in Panama and Colombia. The Darien Gap is frightening because it feels like a place that's still resisting being crossed. UNESCO describes Darien as the bridge between North and South America and says the park contains an exceptional variety of habitats, including mangroves, swamps, and lowland and upland tropical forests. The Biosphere Reserve description goes even further, calling it the most extensive lowland tropical forest on the Pacific coast in Central America, and one of the most diverse ecosystems in the Americas. Its forest is not just thick, it's broken up by wetlands, rivers, creeks, swamps, and rising terrain that make movement difficult from the start. What makes Darien especially unsettling, though, is how quickly the ground will change. UNESCO notes that the landscape runs from sea level up to Cerro Tarcacuna at about 1,800 meters, and that includes sandy beaches, rocky shores, palm forests, and different kinds of rainforest. In a place like that, there's no single set of rules for traveling through it. One stretch may be mud and marsh, the next may be steep forested slopes. Then the ground will give way to creeks and rivers. Even the beauty of the place adds to the tension, because such a biologically rich forest can also be physically exhausting and disorienting. You're never really dealing with only trees, you're dealing with a whole system of water, heat, vegetation, and elevation at the same time. And that's why Darien earns the reputation without really needing any folklore at all. It is scary in the oldest sense of the word. It reminds you how small a person is inside a landscape that was never shaped for easy passage. This is not a park where the wilds part itself safely in the background. The wilderness is the point here. It's one of the last places in the Americas where the forest still feels like a real barrier rather than scenery. And that's exactly what makes it so intimidating. Number 9. The Okapi Wildlife Reserve in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Okapi Wildlife Reserve, it sits inside the Ituri Forest, and UNESCO says it protects about 1/5 of that forest in northeastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's part of the Congo River Basin. It's one of the largest drainage systems in Africa, and that alone gives the place a heavy feeling. This is not a small, isolated patch of trees. It is part of one of the largest forest systems on the earth. It has a mix of dense evergreen forest, humid semi-evergreen forest, swamp forest along the waterways, clearings known locally as edos, and rocky outcroppings. So even before you think about the animals here, the landscape itself is already layered and hard to read. And then there's the wildlife. That's another reason the forest feels so formidable. UNESCO says the reserve contains about 5,000 okapi, 1/6 of the existing population, and it also supports the threatened primates and birds. It protects the largest population of forest elephants still present in eastern DRC, along with the bongo, forest buffalo, and giant forest hog, and other species that belong to this dense tropical forest rather than open ground. Nothing about it feels open or predictable. It is a forest that's built on shade, water, and distance. But what makes it especially unsettling is that the danger is not only environmental. UNESCO identified commercial poaching and artisanal mining as key challenges, and it's repeatedly reported deadly attacks on guards there, including a 2012 attack that killed a park staff and a 2020 incident in which 2 reserve employees were killed. That kind of history changes the atmosphere completely. This is not just a biologically rich forest. It's a place where conservation has had to continue under real pressure and real violence. So the fear here comes from 2 directions at once: the vastness of the forest itself, and the fact that protecting it has never been simple or safe. Number 8. The Tsingy de Bemaraha and the Andrefana dry forests in Madagascar. Western Madagascar. It's got forests that look dangerous even before you know anything about them. UNESCO describes the Andrefana dry forests, which include the Tsingy, as part of a landscape of karstic terrain and limestone uplands that are cut into Tsingy peaks of a forest of limestone needles. It includes real undisturbed forests, lakes, mangrove swamps, rolling hills, and the canyon of the Mamabolo River. Now, it's that combination is what makes this place unnerving. It's not only a forest, it's a forest that's threaded through one of the sharpest and strangest landscapes on the planet. The word forest does usually suggest shelter. Here, it also suggests exposure. The fear of Tsingy is very physical. The limestone formations are not rounded or gentle. UNESCO describes them as peaks and needles, which tells you exactly how hostile the terrain can appear. A person moving through this region is not just thinking about dense vegetation, they're thinking about canyons, broken stone, vertical rock, and narrow passages. It looks like a place that would punish your mistakes quickly, and that's part of why it's so visually striking. It doesn't resemble the comfortable idea of a forest at all. It resembles a natural fortress full of blades, gaps, and dead ends. UNESCO also notes that the undisturbed forests, lakes, and swamps here are habitat for rare and endangered lemurs and birds, and that gives the landscape another layer of coolness. It's not a barren stone maze, it is alive. Forest and wildlife continue to exist in and around these extreme rock formations. And because the fear comes from the actual shape of the land, it doesn't need any myths attached to it. Just looking at it is enough to understand why most people would think twice before wandering too far inside. Moving on to number 7, Bwindi Impenetrable Forest in Uganda. Bwindi earns its name. UNESCO describes it as one of the largest remaining areas in East Africa where Afro-montane lowland forest still extends well into the montane forest belt. It sits on the eastern edge of the Albertine Rift Valley, and it's considered a biodiversity hotspot. Uganda Wildlife Authority says the park spread across steep ridges and deep valleys and forms the watershed for 5 major rivers. That terrain is part of why the forest feels kind of intimidating. Even before you think about the animals there, the basic act of moving through Bwindi means dealing with the moisture, the roots, and the dense growth. It's not the kind of forest that invites a casual wandering. And then there's the wildlife, which adds another level of gravity to this place. UNESCO says Bwindi's home to almost half of the world's mountain gorilla population, and it's one of the richest mammalian assemblages in Africa. It also supports chimpanzees, African elephants, hundreds of bird species, and a remarkable range of trees, ferns, and butterflies. Uganda Wildlife Authority lists more than 120 mammal species and more than 350 bird species in the park. Now, none of that makes Bwindi frightening in a sensational way. It makes it frightening because it's obviously real wilderness. The forest is dense because so much life depends on it, and it's that density that creates the feeling you're moving through a place that belongs first to the animals, not to you. There is also something unsettling about how sharply Bwindi meets the human world. UNESCO says the forest is an oasis inside one of the most densely populated rural areas in the country, with more than 350 people per square kilometer around it. That means the boundary between settlement and deep forest is abrupt. One moment there's agriculture and village life, the next there's an ancient forest that survived while much of the surrounding landscape has changed. It feels less like entering a park and more like stepping into a remnant of an older world that never really opened itself up to human comfort. Number 6. The Black Forest in Germany. The Black Forest makes this list for a different reason than most of the others. It's not remote in the way that Darien or Ituri is, and it's not packed with crocodiles or tigers. What makes it disturbing is its atmosphere. The official German tourism material described the Black Forest National Park as over 15,000 acres of wild nature where, in some areas, the forest has been left to develop without any human intervention for more than 100 years. The national park itself says that in the core zone, nature is in charge, and that animals and plants take priority over everything else except paths and visitor facilities. Now that idea alone changes the way the place feels. You're not in a neat landscape. You're in a place where the forest is being allowed to become itself again. The park describes dark forests, idyllic valleys, lakes, moorlands, and rugged outcrops that support species including adders. And on the wilderness trail, visitors are told they must be very sure-footed because there are thick trunks, rocks, and upturned roots everywhere. The same official guide says the path can be slippery too, and that people should be aware of the dangers of being in a natural forest because they walk at their own risk. That's the key to the forest here. It looks calm from a distance, but once you're inside it, the ground becomes uneven, the woods become darker, and the forest stops feeling decorative. Part of that mood comes from what the forest has already lived through. The national park explains that Storm Lothar in 1999 tore through the upland forest and uprooted large numbers of trees. Some areas then were left alone, allowing the dead wood, new growth, and shifting natural process to reshape most of the landscape. The Wilderness Trail Guide says that that's why the area feels one step wilder than most. That phrase is perfect. The Black Forest is scary not because it's beyond civilization, but because even in Central Europe, it still feels ancient, dim, and indifferent. It reminds you how quickly a forest can go from picturesque to unsettling once the light drops and the trail narrows. Number 5. The Russian Taiga. The Russian taiga. This is frightening in a way that's very different from a tropical jungle. It doesn't rely on obvious drama. There's no mangrove roots rising out of the mud and no heavy rainforest canopy dripping over crocodile-infested water. What makes it so unsettling is the climate and the scale. Britannica describes the taiga as a huge belt of northern forest stretching across Eurasia and says the Asian taiga extends across Russia and southward into northeastern China and Mongolia. They also note that over most of Siberia, the dominant vegetation zone is swampy forest or taiga, and that Siberia is notorious for the length and severity of its winters. In the taiga as a whole, January temperatures are generally below -10 degrees Celsius, and parts of the far eastern Siberia record winter temperatures around -50 Celsius. Even before you get into any details, that combination tells you what kind of place this is. The taiga doesn't behave like the typical image people have of a forest. The biome includes closed canopy forests and huge river systems like the Yenisei and Lena flowing north through it. In western Siberia, those rivers create a lowland basin with large areas of poorly drained peaty wetlands. That means the taiga is not just a wall of pines. In many places, it's a patchwork of forest, bog, and wet ground. In reality, it's a forest landscape where the cold and water are working together. You can be surrounded by timber and still be in terrain that's difficult to cross and difficult to predict. That's part of why the Russian taiga feels so severe. And there's the question of wildlife here. The taiga becomes more intimidating when you consider it. Heilong Overview describes the Russian Far East as part of one of the most biologically diverse temperate forest regions in the world. The World Wildlife Foundation says that on the Russian side alone, there's some 2,800 plant species and more than 600 animal species. It identifies a region as key habitats for the endangered Amur tiger and the critically endangered Amur leopard. Britannica separately notes that the Siberian or Amur tiger lives in the cold climate forests of the Kharbarovsk region in eastern Russia and northeastern China, and fewer than 600 remain in the wild. Add to that brown bears, musk deer, and a huge wetland bird habitat, and the forest stops feeling like an empty wilderness. It feels occupied, but occupied on terms that have nothing to do with our comfort. Snow here doesn't often hit this forest so much as expose how little room there is for mistakes. A frozen river may look like an open route, but in a landscape this cold, exposure is part of the threat. A stand of conifers may look protective, but the forest itself is shaped by severe winters and growing seasons, which explains that beyond the sparse taiga is a forested tundra where only patches of trees remain, and that some of these trees reproduce only sporadically. You're not stepping into a place of abundance in the same way you would in the Amazon. You're stepping into a place where life persists under pressure. That's a different kind of fear, but it may be the more honest one. Then there's the human story here, which makes part of the taiga feel even darker. The World Wildlife Foundation, reporting on the Ussuri taiga in the Russian Far East, says illegal logging here has reached a crisis proportion, with hardwood exports exceeding legal limits and the ecosystem is being pushed towards a breaking point. They say that the widespread timber theft has harmed the region ecologically, economically, and even socially, while also putting pressures on habitats used by the tigers. This is not only a forest of cold rivers, wetlands, deep snow, and rare predators, it's a forest under strain, where some of the most extraordinary woodland left in northern Eurasia has had to endure both nature and its harshest people at their most extractive. It is vast, it's cold, wet, biologically active, and in many places, still far beyond the kind of control that makes a landscape feel safe. Number 4. The Congo Basin Rainforest. The Congo Basin is scary for one very simple reason: it's big enough to feel endless. The World Wildlife Foundation says the basin forest spans around 500 million acres, covers 6 countries, and accounts for more than 70% of Africa's tropical forests. Now, those two facts alone already place it in a different category from most forested areas people think about. This is not a dark patch of woodland on the edge of a town, it's one of the Earth's great continuous forest systems. When a forest reaches this scale, fear changes its character. It's no longer about whether a certain trail looks spooky. It becomes about what it means to enter a living region so large it can seem to absorb settlements and human plans without really changing its own identity. The equatorial climate over much of the basin is matched by a dense evergreen forest that spreads across the Central Depression almost continuously, from about 4 degrees north to about 5 degrees south. And it's interrupted only by clearings, many of them natural. It's not only dense, it is wet, layered, and broken by waterways and swamps. The clearings don't necessarily make it easier. In a forest this large, a clearing can feel less like a relief and more like a reminder of how much country still surrounds you. The river basins here, the wet ground, immense tree cover, and the continuity of the forest are all working together to make the land feel closed, even when parts of it are physically open. The World Wildlife Foundation says the Congo Basin is home to 1 in 5 of Earth's living species, and includes at least 400 mammals, 1,000 birds, 700 fish species, and it also highlights the critically endangered forest elephant, and says the basin contains the largest number and diversity of great ape species. That's enough to change how the forest feels in your mind. It's a place that stops feeling like background scenery when you know it shelters some of the most intelligent, powerful, and elusive animals on the planet. The fear here is not based on some single dramatic predator lurking behind every tree. It comes from the fact that the forest is intensely inhabited. You're walking into a region where the animal life has had the room to remain large-scale and complex, and that's what part of makes the Congo Basin one of the most awe-inspiring forests in the world, and also one of the most intimidating. A forest like this can make distance feel strange. It can make you lose the sense that there's any edge nearby, and it can make the world feel horizontal and endless at the same time. And because the climate is equatorial, the forest doesn't offer the sharp seasonal contrast that helps some northern forests feel readable. Instead, it stays green, humid, and layered. And the result is a place that can feel deeply enclosing. Not because it's supernatural, but because the ecology itself creates that impression. You don't need a myth to make the Congo River Basin scary. It is already that enough. Number 3. The Amazon Rainforest. The Amazon sits this high on this list because it doesn't feel like a single forest. It feels like an entire world. The World Wildlife Foundation says the Amazon spans 9 political territories: Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. The same overview says it covers about 2.7 million square miles in the Amazon basin, holds around 1.4 billion acres of dense forest, and contains around 20% of the world's liquid fresh water. Some sources go even further and call the Amazon rainforest the world's richest and most varied biological reservoir, containing several million species of insects, plants, birds, and other life forms, many still unrecorded by science. When a forest has that scale and that level of biological complexity, it stops feeling like a destination and starts feeling like an environment that can overwhelm you before you even understand where you are. That's the first thing that makes the Amazon pretty scary. It's not just large, it's too large to reduce to one experience. The second thing is water. People often imagine the Amazon as a dense green wall, but there's a description of the Amazon basin that makes it clear that the forest is constantly being shaped by the river systems and seasonal flooding there. More than 2/3 of the basin is covered by an immense rainforest, and that means the Amazon's not just one fixed landscape. It changes with water, and in some areas the forest floor and the river margin are not stable year-round. Even if you never mention danger in a dramatic way, that alone gives the Amazon a difficult character, a
place is much harder to master when the difference between land and water is seasonal. Then there's the wildlife, which is part of why the Amazon's so visually powerful and so intimidating. There are jaguars, manatees, tapirs, capybaras, rodents, and several types of monkeys among major wildlife here. This region is one of the Earth's last refuge for jaguars, harpy eagles, and pink river dolphins, and it's also home to thousands of birds and butterflies. The WWF adds that the basin includes around 2,400 freshwater fish species and 370 reptiles. The rivers here branch, canopies, the muddy margins, and the flooded forests all belong to different sets of species. You're never really just dealing with terrain, you're dealing with the whole ecological system. The forest never feels empty here. But what really makes it especially unnerving is that its scale can cancel out the reassuring details people usually depend on. In a smaller forest, you can tell yourself that a river will lead somewhere, that a clearing means an edge can't be far away, or that the trees themselves are at least the main challenge. In the Amazon, none of those thoughts are especially comforting. 2.7 million square miles, 1.4 billion acres of dense forest, and 1/5 of the world's liquid freshwater. Descriptions of annual floodplains and immense rainforest covering most of the basin makes it even clearer. The geography here is so large and so interconnected that ordinary reference points lose their usefulness. The Amazon is frightening because it's not a forest you can mentally shrink down into a manageable idea. It just keeps expanding as you learn more about it. Number 2. The Salonga National Park in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. UNESCO describes it as Africa's largest tropical rainforest reserve, located in the central basin of the Congo River, and says it's very isolated and accessible only by water. The World Heritage description also calls it the largest protected area of dense rainforest, with a protected area of roughly 3.6 million acres. What makes Salonga especially unnerving, though, is the kind of rainforest it is. UNESCO says it is marshland areas and practically inaccessible gallery forests, some of which have never been explored and may still be considered practically virgin. Now that's a remarkable thing for an official description to say. It means the fear here is not something a visitor has to imagine. The forest is genuinely difficult to move through, and it's difficult to know. Gallery forest adds another layer because it follows waterways in a corridor where light, water, and vegetation are all combined to make travel feel constrained. In Salonga, that's not the exception. It's part of the defining character of this place. The rainforest here is an obstacle, not a scenery. The wildlife, too, does deepen that feeling. UNESCO identifies Salonga as a habitat for the bonobo, the Congo peacock, the forest elephant, and the African slender-snouted crocodile, among other threatened species. Bonobos are one of humanity's closest living relatives, but in Salonga they're not symbols of familiarity. They are part of a forest system that's still large enough and intact enough to sustain complex communities on a huge scale. Forest elephants belong to the dense woodland, not the open savannas, which means this environment itself is part of what makes the encounters hard to predict. Crocodiles, deep water, flooded margins, and dense tropical growth all add to the sense that this is not a place shaped around human comfort. In a mountain landscape, danger can often be seen. In Salonga, much of the danger comes from concealment. There's a description of difficult access, huge marshlands and forests that have barely been explored to points where a person can't count on visibility or quick exit. Even its size works against you, and UNESCO says the park's one of the most extensive in the world and large enough to provide viable habitat for its plants and animals. The more complete an ecosystem is, the less it feels arranged for people. Salonga feels old, closed, and functional on its own terms. The history of this place makes it even heavier. Management notes that describe long-term pressures including poaching, bushmeat trafficking, forest exploitation, illicit fishing using toxic products, and the difficulty of monitoring such a huge area. It's also involved in the reality of trying to protect a huge rainforest under difficult political conditions. A forest becomes more unsettling when even the people assigned to defend it have faced serious risk there. At the same time, though, Salonga is not simply a story of loss. In 2021, UNESCO announced that the park had been removed from the list of World Heritage in danger because of improvements in its state conservation. UNESCO said anti-poaching measures had been strengthened, bonobo populations remained stable, and forest elephant populations had slowly begun recovering. That doesn't make the forest feel less intimidating though. If anything, it sharpens the picture. Salonga is scary not because it's ruined, but because it's enormous, difficult, and ecologically active. It's one of those rare places where the forest still feels larger than the systems trying to manage it. Number 1. Gunung Leuser and the Leuser ecosystem in Indonesia. Gunung Leuser sits at the top because it combines almost every real quality that makes a forest intimidating. Dense tropical growth, mountainous terrain, major predators, critically endangered megafauna, and a long history of pressure from logging, poaching, and encroachment. Gunung Leuser National Park is one of 3 components of UNESCO's Tropical Rainforest Heritage of Sumatra. This is a protected area covering about 2.5 million acres. UNESCO says the wider property is one of the biggest conservation areas in Southeast Asia and holds the greatest potential for long-term conservation. More importantly for us, though, it says the ecosystem here, including the Gunung Leuser National Park, is by far the largest and most significant forest remnant remaining on Sumatra. It means it's not just another rainforest. It's one of the last great surviving blocks of a forest world that used to be much larger. The property stretches from the Bukit Barisan mountain range down through huge changes in altitude with vegetation zones that run from lowland rainforest to montane forest and even subalpine scrub and shrub thickets. Some parts of the wider property face the Indian Ocean, and UNESCO notes that the altitudinal span runs from sea level to the highest mountains on Sumatra. That means it's not a single forest type. It's a vertical system of rainforests, mountain forests, slopes, valleys, rivers, and clouded uplands. It's not just a green wall, it is a huge, wet, mountainous landscape. Current state of conservation reporting focuses on key species across the Heritage of Sumatra area: the Sumatran tiger, rhino, elephant, and orangutan. A technical evaluation says that it contains habitats for all 4 of those threatened, critically threatened, or endemic large mammals. The World Wildlife Foundation, in a separate report on Sumatra, describes the Sumatran rainforests as the only place on Earth where elephants, orangutans, rhinos, and tigers coexist in the wild. Most forests have one defining animal. Leuser has an entire cast of them, not just small ones. A rainforest that can hold great apes, elephants, rhinos, and tigers at the same time is not just biodiverse, it is inherently intimidating. The Sumatran tiger, it's not just another large cat, it is the top predator in an already dense, hard-to-read environment. Elephants bring a different kind of tension because their movement and range are tied to large habitats. Orangutans change the feel of the canopy itself, reminding you that this is a 3-dimensional forest where life is happening high above you, above the ground. Rhinos add another layer because they belong to thick, difficult forest rather than open terrain. The ground, the undergrowth, the riverbanks, and the canopy are all claimed by different forms of life, and many of the animals there are rare enough to be precious and large enough to be genuinely formidable. Its conservation history makes the fear feel even more grounded. UNESCO places the Tropical Rainforest Heritage of Sumatra on the list of World Heritage in Danger in 2011 to help address threats including poaching and illegal logging. A World Heritage Committee decision transcribed intense pressure from road construction, encroachment, logging, poaching, and mining prospecting, and they linked road access directly to illegal logging and poaching. This history is important because it shows that Leuser is not just biologically extraordinary, it's a forest whose survival is inseparable from how hard it is to keep large, intact rainforests from being opened up. And that probably is the most unsettling thing about this place. It's frightening not just because of what lives there, but because of it showing how quickly a great forest becomes more vulnerable once the access increases. In other words, the same thing that would make the forest easier for humans to enter is also one of the clearest threats to what makes it extraordinary in the first place. Leuser is a place where wilderness is still powerful enough to feel intimidating, but also fragile enough that every new opening in it matters. You don't need folklore or myth to make a forest like this unsettling. The facts do the job on their own. It is beautiful though, globally important, and it's still wild enough that stepping into it means stepping into a landscape that is clearly not built around a human ease.